Okay, I guess we're off. First of all, thank you all for showing up. SIG-GCP is a new special interest group around the Google Cloud Platform. I've got an agenda. I hope you've all opened it. It's been linked to it through the email announcements, and it's on the Slack channel header and stuff. But we're going to go through briefly some introductions and kind of basic working rules, I think, for what the SIG should be trying to do. And then maybe we could kind of briefly introduce each other, what we actually want to get from the SIG, and what we think, why we're showing up, basically. My take on the goals of these meetings, it's to give an explicit forum for users and developers of Kubernetes to talk about GCP and GCP-related issues. To date, it's been a somewhat delicate balance to talk about that because as a very Google-heavy project, making great efforts to be neutral for cloud providers, there hasn't really been a natural place to think about just Google Cloud Platform related work. So that's really what the point of this is. The meetings themselves should serve as a place where people who are kind of intimately tied to how Kubernetes works on Google Cloud Platform can find out what work is underway, what changes might be being made. If they have proposals for work that they want to undertake, they should be able to bring them here and get some useful feedback. And this should really be like the central forum for that kind of activity. If there's a non-goal for this meeting, I think what worried me a little when I was thinking of setting it up was it could easily turn into a place where people just show up with their Google Cloud Platform problems. And I think everybody who's used this has bumped into kind of like a pretty long list of problems. And if it just became like office hours for fixing the issues you're facing with Google Cloud Platform, I don't think that would take off. I don't think many people would show up. I don't think that would actually be a successful thing. And of course, we're not saying like, people won't answer questions. This isn't a place to come for help. But I think a real balance needs to be struck. And that kind of leads me to the grid that I had below, where I'm explicitly asking people to kind of, as they introduce themselves, not simply to say what they want from the SIG, but also what they're hoping to provide to the SIG. And so people should, we need as many givers as takers if the thing is to balance and be successful, I feel. The other thing I'll mention before I kind of yield and see if other people have comments on all of this, some basic proposals for how the group should work together. And I think these are very common to pretty much Kubernetes as a whole and all of the other special interest groups. But it's important that debate and discussion be very respectful. We should appreciate that everybody else is trying to do work with good intentions, trying to do the right thing, and I think one of the big phrases is, assume people are not idiots. People have, reasons for thinking things, and we should find them out. And that kind of also leads to trying to be inclusive. As many viewpoints as possible lead to a much kind of stronger product. And that's kind of that's an important thing. If there's something you don't understand or we don't understand, we should seek to find out what it is rather than just presume it's not relevant. And the other thing, and I emphasize this because I've got terrible hearing. I find the kind of video chat's hard enough as it is. But if you're not talking, I should say, please mute. I think, again, that's a common pattern, but it is important, otherwise we lose a lot of time. So I'll shut up for a minute in case anybody on the call or anybody around the table wants to talk about what they think GCP maybe should be or shouldn't be. Okay, I guess as stated, it made sense to everyone. I would ask people if they can to actually fill in the grid in the minutes to put their name in and fill in a row if you're present at the meeting. I think that would be kind of a useful thing for everyone else. In the next item to talk about, we had Walter Fender, who's been working hard in the cloud provider working group, specifically around GCP extraction. And so I will yield the floor to him.
So, hi everyone. Quick overview of what the cloud provider effort is. Currently today, we have a cloud interface and a cloud plugin. That cloud plugin goes into the Kube API server, the Kube controller manager, and the kubelet itself, and is used to make calls out to the hosting cloud provider to do various things like provide routes, provide IP addresses, provide custom volumes, determine whether or not a given node is still considered to be present in the cloud, etc. We have 7 in-tree implementations of a cloud provider. The big 3 are pretty obvious: Google, Amazon, and Microsoft. But we do have a few others, I think like VMware, one from Red Hat, etc. And due to the fact that Go doesn't have a particularly good dynamic plugin mechanism that's production ready, all of those have to be loaded at runtime for Kubernetes to work, irrespective of which cloud provider you're using, or in fact, even if you are using a cloud provider. So that means we have a lot of extra code running that isn't needed, which is bloating up certain things. It also means that for the cloud providers in question, they have to go and get their code reviewed for something that only affects them. And so for all of the cloud providers, this ends up being a bit of a slowdown for development, where they go, I want to make this change to the way I make cloud provider calls, and it has to be reviewed by the entire open source community, and we can't do very quick fixes, whether you're Google, Amazon, Red Hat, Microsoft. So the idea was we came up with was, hey, let's attempt to shift all of that burden into an isolated cloud code. We're generally at this point going to call it the cloud controller manager. There's a little bit more, and I'll discuss that in a little bit. But the general idea is to take all the cloud-specific code that is central and run it in the cloud controller manager, and eventually get to the point where that cloud controller manager is built for a cloud provider specifically. So that will then allow you to take that code, move it outside of the core Kubernetes area into a cloud provider specific area, and allow there to be almost a Kubernetes kernel, much in the way that we are familiar with for things like Linux. So that's the plan. We generally now refer to it as stage 1 and stage 2. The stage 1 plan is to create the cloud controller manager in tree and move the 7 big in-repo cloud providers into it and prove that it can be done and isolate out that cloud provider code. And then stage 2 is actually then taking that and moving it out completely out of tree. We've already seen some benefits, so not particularly great, not ones we see for like Google, but all new cloud providers today actually start out in quote-unquote stage 2. So if you look at companies like Rancher, they've got working Kubernetes in stage 2, where they're just running all their cloud-specific code in their own cloud controller manager, and everything's working. So now the effort is for the big 7 to try and move their code out so that it becomes a nicer world for everyone to live in. Specifically, I'm working on the Google portion of this. So a couple of things obviously going on in flight. One is that we need a new repo. So at some point in the future, there will be an additional repo where all the Google Cloud specific code is going to live. I imagine it's also going to be where for instance, all of the scripts that currently live under cluster GCE are going to move, etc. So, you know, at this point, there are if people are interested, there are definitely a couple of documents I can link for the various progress we've seen. There are also several PRs out. There's a work in progress PR that I have, which is the proof of concept. So we actually have a working stage 1 GCE version of this. There are some hacks in it, which I'm not hugely fond of, but it at least proves that everything can be done, and then it allows me to break it into small pieces that I can check in, because that PR is in the tens of thousands of lines of code. The other interesting points of note on that, there are going to be we're going to see some changes as things move along. I'm in the process, I don't know how familiar everyone is with the code, but I'm in the process of doing things like breaking down node controller. Node controller is fairly huge, and there are 3 GCP calls in it. And it seems unfortunate to move the entire node controller over to the cloud controller manager if we can avoid it. So there's going to be some re-architecting for things like that. The other interesting problem that Google, Microsoft, and Amazon have is that we all have volumes that are cloud specific. So, you know, obviously for Google, that's the Google Persistent Disk. Right now, working with the storage and volumes team, we have no easy way of moving those out yet. There is an initiative called CSI, which is essentially a mechanism by which the volume controller, or working wherever it happens to be working, can make a sideways call to a sidecar process that can then do the heavy lifting. That is supposed to be alpha in 1.9. However, at Google, we tend to prefer to work with features that are beta. And the beta for that feature is probably not before 1.11. And if I wanted to be absolutely certain, I'd call it 1.12. So the full move out may be delayed on that. I've been working on some ways we could try and move out early. Flex, for instance, is an option. It's not an option that I love, especially since it's been around for a lot longer, but it is still in alpha. And I don't think anyone really wants to take it to beta with CSI coming. So that's one interesting problem that we have. The other interesting thing, of course, is that we are still going through and finding all of the interesting places where we see a call that, in fact, I found one just yesterday in Kubelet that says, well, someone else found it and pointed it out to me, but if cloud equals GCE, do something special. And so it's not actually a cloud call, but it still has GCE specific code, and all of that needs to be dealt with as part of this migration. So that's the top level view. I'm happy to talk about any details that anyone has, if there's anything specific you want to know about. If you want to take just quickly on how one actually goes about this, the 3 systems I talked about, the Kube API server, the Kube controller manager, and the kubelet, all have a plugin, cloud plugin flag, which today would be set to GCE. The way we sort of experiment with this is if you set it to external, then that service can no longer make calls to the cloud plugin. Obviously, then you also need to bring up the cloud controller manager, which the cluster up scripts today do not do. But when I send out the work in progress, or the documentation, I can also link the work in progress that shows the rather significant set of cluster up changes that are needed to set those flags and get the whole process going. Any questions?
Yeah, I got Two questions. The first is, this is all fantastic info. I'm sort of a newcomer to the whole cloud provider thing, and it's great to get such a substantive update. Generally speaking, I go to the Kubernetes community repo to find out about all of the working groups and SIGs that are involved in Kubernetes. And today, the cloud provider working group is not listed there. I think a lot of the information that you just talked about would be would get a lot more traffic if you put it there and then sort of broadcast like, hey, if you want to find out everything that this group is doing, go look here. That's generally the place where everybody goes to look for all the other working groups and SIGs. And I linked the issue in Zoom chat. I can ping you in Slack as well if that would be helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. There is a ticket to add the working group. It's been stalled for 2 weeks. I don't have a good answer. I can follow up and try and see why that change hasn't gone through yet, but I completely agree with you.
Okay. Second question. This is more, I'm trying to understand as a member of the steering committee how this is tribally happening. So I imagine you're having to make some substantive changes to the controller manager as you go about this process. Who do you see as owning the controller manager?
That is an excellent question, and is the question that I made the mistake of asking when I volunteered to start this project.
Like organically, who are you going to get consensus from, or who do you find you have to, where are you getting redirected?
Yeah, so I made this comment, I need an owner for the controller manager for this project to have any value. This apparently is how one volunteers to become the owner. So from Google's perspective, on the Google side of this picture, I now own controller manager.
Okay.
Obviously, we need owners outside of Google, and even inside Google, we like to refer to the what if someone wins the lottery. So my first question is, okay, great, I own controller manager. What if I win the lottery?
So the steering committee is going to be less interested in who as an individual owns it and more what is the group of people who are responsible for it.
Right. And so where I come to with the what if I win the lottery, we discussed it quite a bit, and the SIG that is probably most affected by this is workloads.
Okay.
And so I've had discussions with the SIG workloads team, at least within Google, and they have agreed to back me up in terms of, becoming owners, becoming very knowledgeable, etc. on that code. And in fact, the majority of controllers in the controller manager already belong to them.
So to be clear, when we're talking about workloads, that makes me think of either the resource management working group, or it makes me think of SIG-Apps, which owns
SIG-Apps.
SIG-Apps. Okay. Thank you. That clarifies a bunch.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. And sort of one of the, I realized it wasn't actually asked, but just as an implication, like there are a lot of changes that are going to be coming through. I have been working extensively with DIMS, WLAN0, and Tim Hawkin on all the architectural changes I'm trying to push through. And there's about 9 members of the cloud provider working group at this point. And I think I'm actually the only person from Google in that working group. So there is somewhat of a broad representation across Kubernetes there. The other thing that I will mention, we are going to actually need a lot of effort from outside of Google. We have 6 other in-tree providers that we need to have actually start pushing this through for this to be successful. And so I was talking with Ken from SIG-Apps, and we were coming up with a plan where in 110, we were going to start actively trying to find an owner for every one of the in-tree cloud providers to try and help push this through. We just wanted to have a clear roadmap where we could show, hey, Google has successfully moved out and shown that there is a reasonable path to get out of tree, and we are being successful at it.
You will find tremendous support from the steering committee in that regard. You talked about wanting to create a new repo. I would go talk to SIG architecture. If you already aren't aware, that's probably the best path to go there. And your talk of eventually removing where the cluster scripts live, just make sure that you get in touch with the appropriate people at SIG testing to make sure we know where we should be pulling the appropriate scripts to build and test clusters. This would be especially concerning to us in the context of different release branches. We tend to have at least the previous 3 releases buildable and testable at any time.
I completely agree with that. And in fact, I don't know, this is getting into the weeds, but one of the issues I have is that there is a fair amount of startup control that is actually already out of tree. So Kubernetes test infra has a separate set of startup controls that control the sizes of all the pieces and how things work when doing scale and performance testing. And I've already been bitten a couple of times there. When I start up an additional cloud controller manager, since right now it has all of the plugins in it, we're seeing a slight inflate of the size of the master, such that it no longer fits in an N1 standard 1. It requires an N1 standard 2. And that means that right now all the performance and scale tests fail to start because I have no easy way of changing the startup scripts in test infra just for my work in progress.
Okay, well, we're, this is getting a little off topic, but we're happy to take that up over in SIG testing. And I also participate in SIG scalability. I know Shyam's pretty actively involved in the scale and performance tests. And as the CI signal lead, I can tell you they're failing for their current build of Kubernetes anyway. So,
awesome. So anyone else have any questions, anything they'd like to chat about the cloud provider work? One thing I will mention that I meant to mention earlier, and I apologize, this is strictly meant to accelerate performance, make it easier for all of the cloud providers to move quickly, and that sort of thing. We are putting in conformance testing in a separate working group. No part of this is intended to sort of fracture Kubernetes, and in fact, one of the things that we need to spend some time on is working out not just how to do testing and make sure that all the cloud providers continue to work on OSS builds, but also that all of the custom cloud provider builds are not only are working, but are conformant to the Kubernetes standards of what it means to be Kubernetes. We are not trying to fork or provide differentiators here, right? This is really just about trying to make it easier to build Kubernetes quickly, to move forward quickly, to allow patching and fixing of code quickly and easily, not to try and fragment what it means to be Kubernetes.
Walter, just a quick question. As I'm kind of getting to know the process, what has been the review process with other cloud providers, to agree on the architecture that it described?
That's actually an excellent question. So this project began in 1.6, which is actually before my time. So I know Tim Hawken, Brian Grant from Google, and then Siddharth Mani from Rancher did a lot of the initial push for this. There was already a cloud provider interface where the cloud provider plugin comes. So this is a long-winded way of saying that that is an excellent question, and this, as far as I know, the steering committee and SIG architecture have agreed to all of the stuff that I'm talking about. I do not know where along this process the other cloud providers agreed, and in fact, interestingly enough, I know there has been a little tension there. At this point, you cannot become in-tree. SIG architecture said no more in-tree cloud providers. And so this working group, a lot of the motivation for this working group is giving a solution for out-of-tree cloud providers. But along the way, it became clear, hey, if we're going to be moving everyone out of tree, we need a level playing field. We should make it so that everyone is out of tree. And in fact, getting everyone out of tree helps everyone, both in that I don't have to worry about being accidentally broken by Amazon, an init function in Amazon where they're trying to set themselves up, which is invoked because it's Go and init functions get invoked. And I also, I can shrink the size of my code. I'm less likely to be impacted by them. And so the general feeling is that this is good for everyone, both in the abstract and in the particulars. But yeah, the long-winded way of saying I don't know. I assume that all happened before my time. At this point, though, every change going through has a PR. And I'm being, as many of the Google engineers are, I'm being very conscious of trying to make sure that every one of my PRs is being reviewed by at least one non-Googler, because I don't want to have any perception that, this is a Google project. We're trying to be inclusive of the community as a whole. And so I'm trying to make sure that every one of my PRs related to this is being reviewed by an outside member.
Are you tempted to do a similar kind of overview as here with SIG Azure and SIG AWS to kind of test the waters?
I think that's a great idea, yeah. And the other thing I will say is that like I said, the cloud provider working group is 9 members, one of which is from Google. I believe we have at least one Azure guy on that. I don't know that we have an AWS member yet.
Any other questions for Walter? Okay, thank you very much. And the next item on the agenda is a proposal from Aaron, which I'll admit is a somewhat intimidating proposal, and I'll let him speak on it.
Sure. So it's kind of a proposal in that I have already done it, but I am looking for guidance on how to accomplish this practically. All right, so I'm wearing my CI Signal lead as the 1.9 for the 1.9 release team hat. In the meeting notes, I linked a doc where I took the shocking step of actually documenting what I think I'm supposed to be doing in this role. And that involves, on a daily basis, sweeping through a test grid dashboard called Release Master Blocking. In fact, you know what? How about I go ahead and share my screen so I can show you guys why I'm trying, what problem I'm trying to solve here. So if I go to test grid, I go to SIG release, I go to SIG release master blocking. I'm looking at the summary tab, which shows me every single job on this dashboard I expect should be green, or at least not failing, before I cut a release. This is the way our automation scripts are supposed to work. Right now, what we have done historically is, as humans, look at these red things and say, so for the scale job, for example, say, well, we know that like this particular SIG network test case is failing for scale correctness, but we think that's okay, which now means we have to have human intervention to manually interpret each of these results that are red. We really want to get to the case where everything should be green. So right now, I'm looking at a summary tab that shows, I'll just blow the text up a little bit in case you can't see. All the GKE jobs are failing. GCI, GKE, GKE device plugin, GKE slow, GKE serial. And what I want to find is somebody who owns GKE who I can ask, hey, what's going on? Why is this failing? Is this a known issue? Is somebody working on this? Because effectively, if these jobs are failing, if a tree is falling in the woods and nobody's paying attention, then why is it even there? If these jobs aren't actively being fixed, why are we bothering to block the release on them failing? It's doing nobody any good. So SIG-GCP seems like a pretty natural place to look to for people who are experts in GKE and who know what's going on and how to fix this. Up until the existence of this SIG, I don't really know what the public-facing way is to get in touch with the GKE team and the GKE people. I've tribally gone to cluster lifecycle because I know Robert H. Bailey and a couple other Googlers hang out there. But what I'm looking for is an official point of contact. So on a similar basis, I know if the AWS job fails, I go poke SIG AWS because I know there are people there who know about AWS and they also know about COPS, which is the way that AWS is stood up. If the scalability job is failing, I go poke SIG scalability because I know they're interested in what's different about their cluster configuration and what they can do to tune it or what special cases they're hitting. So that's effectively what I'm trying to do here is get owners for GKE. I'm also trying to get owners for all of the GCE jobs. So we'll take a look at the GCI GCE job that's currently listed as flaky. So this is a job that just stands up a cluster in Google Compute Engine and runs a bunch of end-to-end tests. You can see on the left here that the end-to-end tests, the individual test cases, are owned by a bunch of individual SIGs. So SIG apps owns this, job should not run to completion. SIG network owns this, proxy version. SIG instrumentation owns this, test about cluster level login. There are a couple tests here that are not owned by any individual SIG, like variable expansion should allow substituting values, whatever that means. And then there's also no SIG listed for the job as a whole. If the entire cluster were to fail to come up for some reason, or some particular way about the GCE cloud provider was something about it was causing the cluster to fail, no SIG has historically owned that. This also seems like a thing that I would expect SIG-GCP to own. And historically, I've had to go poke one of Kubernetes dev, SIG cluster lifecycle, SIG testing, SIG release, SIG API machinery to go find out what's going on. This is entirely too much effort to do on a part-time job. It's practically too much to do on a full-time job as a human. So I want to just find one single point of contact that I can ask to help me figure out if issues are being chased down. Next, I want to walk you through how I'm actually using this so you can understand what it is I'm trying to sign people up for. So basically, if I see that the job is failing in one of those meta stages, I'm going to go find the SIG that owns that job. If it turns out that a test case is failing in that job, I'm not going to go bother the job owner. I'm going to go bother whoever owns the test case, assuming I can find that. If that test case is failing just in that job, though, I'm going to chase down both the test case owner and the job owner and ask, hey, can we please figure this out? So when I talk about chasing people down, what do I mean? I mean, I'm going to be filing issues in GitHub, and I'm going to be labeling them with priority critical urgent, priority failing test. So here's an example of me filing a job and notifying SIG-GCP that SIG cluster lifecycle in this case, because I know they own kubeadm. Here's an example of me notifying them that this job is failing, what's going on. I link to them the particular release that this is blocking. I link them to test grid. I try and give as much information about, hey, this is happening. Is anybody working on this? And then it turns out, actually, I know somebody is working on it. I assign it to them, and they're free to close the issue to let me know that's something I no longer have to have on my radar. So the hope is that, and just here's an example of how that would work for individual test case as well. right? So I'm going to go ping SIG network because I know they own this particular test that's failing. I'm calling it an E2E failure. And I'm trying to provide information about, where this is happening, using all the tools at our disposal to show that this is failing across a number of jobs, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm effectively signing SIG-GCP up to help me triage bugs to the appropriate people who know how to fix them. If it's an instance of a test case failing, and there's some other SIG that owns that, I'll probably just go through that directly. But if it turns out it's not tagged, I'm going to work with the SIG-GCP to figure out who should own this. And for GKE, I, as a non-Googler, just really don't have insight or visibility into what is happening within the walls of Google. Too often, what I have heard historically is, oh yeah, we know that's an issue, and there's nothing I can link to. And it really helps build trust within the community if there's like issues that show that the problem is known and it's being worked, that we can link to. When our PRs aren't working, we can say, oh, my PR is not working because of this thing. Just trying to find ways to elevate attention, keep jobs green, keep everything passing and shipping on a more frequent basis. Any questions?
I've got a few responses, not so much as questions.
Sure.
The first thing is kind of an observation, I think, about a lot of these test jobs. In particular, I very much accept the point that it's the GKE stuff is a bit of a black hole, and it kind of does need an entry point. And I think we need to figure that out as a whole. So that's true. The other observation about them, though, is that more often than not, a GKE test suite is basically a clone of another test suite simply running through the GKE cluster creation path. And so if they're both red for kind of a particular thing, it's probably not necessarily. I guess what I'm saying is it feels that a lot of those cases that fail should actually go to the group that cares about that test suite as a whole. And you might be saying, I guess, for some of these that there is nobody who cares about the test suite as a whole.
I will agree, though. I mean, since one of my CubeMates is the 1.8 branch release manager, yeah. I know just from overhearing there have been some very GKE specific breakages in the last week. So.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, I was the branch manager for 1.8. I got a lot of empathy for digging through release master blocking. It's I used to call it the lucky 8-ball kind of approach to analysis. But one thing that crosses my mind is the idea. One thing I could easily sign up for, even in the current state of SIG-GCP, is something like a GCE and a GKE happy path test job, which doesn't do a great deal, but it establishes clusters, maybe pokes, a simple hello world kind of a job through it, validates it, can do a few things, and then shuts down. I could imagine a test job like that running, and as soon as that goes red, that's clearly a 100% like a GCP issue, because it doesn't do anything other than bring clusters up. And that could be like a canary for some of these other wider issues. For example, the GKE thing that was the load image program or whatever that variable was that took out all the GKE jobs for the past week or two. That would have been caught by this kind of approach quite early. And exactly how we sign up for this is a little TBD. I mean, you can see that we don't have very many participants. There's certainly not kind of a full-time staff team under SIG-GCP yet. To some extent, the number of humans are going to be taskable with SIG-GCP work kind of depends on how the group matures and what kind of pieces of work it takes on and what kind of base it has. And so I'm hoping to develop that. In its current state, it's hard to, essentially it's kind of me. And that's why a lot of these, I saw you throwing over a load of failing test jobs in the past handful of days. That's not something I can really rapidly respond to either. I don't know what you feel about the idea of these kind of like canary jobs for kind of like basic GCP functions.
Canary jobs are helpful. I want to live in the same world where all of the cloud providers are out of tree and each cloud provider is responsible for the quality of their code. I would love to be able to delegate all of the test failures related to that cloud provider to the SIG that owns that cloud provider. And so I would say that the GCE cloud provider is kind of the default and the de facto cloud provider for most of the tests we run, hence why I'm sending everything to this SIG. I completely empathize with the fact that this is a nascent SIG and it's understaffed. What I'm asking for is, can you help me understand who, as a member of the release team, right? Our lives are collectively made a lot better if the right tests are in there, which is kind of a separate orthogonal issue. But that the tests that are in there are actively watched and maintained. And it's kind of too much to expect somebody who is filling this CI signal role to also know exactly who to poke and who to go chase down within the walls of companies that they may not necessarily work at. So like using the cloud provider as the abstraction for the individual cloud provider problems is one, and then assigning a SIG to each of those cloud providers is one way of doing it. Like I said, in the past, I have tribally gone to SIG cluster lifecycle because I just know there's some Googlers who hang out there whose attention will perk up if I talk about GKE failing. So I need help to find these bodies, even if it's not in this SIG.
Yeah. I think we can grow towards what you're talking about. And I kind of, like I say, I can imagine like the GKE level stuff, if the GKE variant of a test suite is failing, whereas the GCE one is happy, and it looks like it's obviously related to GKE. I think that's appropriate to kind of route to SIG-GCP, like as you were doing recently. And I'll start to try and make time to look at that and relay it and try and get some action on that. I don't know if I can feel quite the same about what we call the GCE test jobs, just because almost everything is a GCE test job. And so it's kind of like, that's why I'd rather be on the hook for a GCE canary that validates that clusters can come up and down and there's nothing systemic going wrong.
Right. Well, this is why I was trying to articulate that most often I'm going after the individual test cases. It's only if the job as a whole is failing, or I can't identify who this test case belongs to, that I'm going to come and talk to you. But like the GKE stuff, since it's GKE specific, that's really where I can't do much about that.
That makes sense. I mean, one reason I'm a little nervous is as soon as it started, I think you managed to push 8 or 9 different different failing test jobs straight in. It's like, oh, this is going to be a bit of a fire hose. So,
I'm trying to share. I'm trying to make the rest of the community understand what it is that the release team has to deal with on a daily basis as we go through burn down. It starts really, really difficult for us to say, yes, there is actual signal, let alone whether or not we are aware of people chasing down failures. And this is me just trying to do the current code that's in master. I'm not even trying to go chase down automated upgrade tests and automated downgrade tests, which those, for what it's worth, I'm putting into the bucket of SIG cluster lifecycle because they're generally the upgrade and downgrade people. So what I'm also happy to do is to see if I can find other venues to push forward, hey, this is the new world that I'm trying to work within as the CI signal lead to get additional people in Google to come help you out. If I can say that this is the authoritative touch point, can you please send more resources to this SIG so that we can actually be responsive? Like, I'll do what I can there.
Cool. I appreciate that. Okay. The one thing I'd say is right now, do feel free to ping me directly to kind of like to do stuff, because there's a flood of issues coming through and I can't necessarily, if there's something urgent, like I missed the GKE one because it was buried with 8 others, but really I should have jumped on that because that was like a very wide systemic thing. But anything that is really holding you up, you should ping me directly.
Okay, I'll ping you directly, and maybe just in the interim, you can help me figure out who else I could maybe ping directly just to poke to see if anybody within the walls of Google is noticing this.
Yep, okay.
Thanks a bunch. Much appreciated.
No, thanks for all the work you do trying to make tests actually pass. It's a very non-trivial thing. We've got 10 minutes before the community meeting starts, and I want to keep a whole, like a hard deadline for that so that we don't overlap. But before we go, does anybody else on the call have anything else they want to add or ask or suggest or request? I guess that's a no.
Hi.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, I've got a question.
oh, sure.
Yeah, my name is Alberto. I'm currently working on running self-hosted Kubernetes on GCP.
Cool.
So sometimes I find issues not with Kubernetes, but with GCP specific issues with Google Cloud. So the question basically is this the right place to talk about those issues as well, or maybe not?
Potentially. I mean, like I was saying earlier, I fear that if all we do is talk about problems in GCP, not many people will start, it's not going to be a very engaging thing. I'd like to also talk about what people are doing and kind of like benefits and stuff. But certainly, as a mailing list, you should feel free to kind of like, throw suggestions in and we can see if we can get them routed. I don't want to be kind of like, yeah, we'd SIG-GCP and we won't answer questions about GCP. That'd be ridiculous. But like I said, I don't want this just to degenerate into kind of like a help office hours kind of thing. So do you have a question now?
No, not specifically. It was kind of a general theme.
Okay.
Thanks.
Hey, no worries. Okay, the next meeting will be in 2 weeks. Depending on how things go, this may actually turn into a monthly meeting. There's an expectation we may not have a huge volume of things coming through to actually warrant an actual face-to-face meeting. We'll see how that goes, but certainly for now, it's every 2 weeks. Next week, I'm hoping that I can get Justin Santa Barbara to come and talk about COPS. He's been rewriting parts of COPS so that it works not just for AWS, but also for GCP, which is potentially quite an interesting thing to do. So if we can get him to come and talk about that, that would be great. If there are any things you want to hear about, please either contact me directly, add it to the notes, send an email to mailing list, whatever. But I can kind of try and get people to talk about things if there's stuff that you particularly want to hear about related to GCP. Other than that, thank you all for showing up, and I guess see you in 2 weeks.
Thank you.
Thanks all.